So, hey everyone, Ralston here, owner of Strive Academics. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about what school is going to look like in the fall. So, welcome to Ahead of the Curve, where we talk about the tips, strategies, and resources students and families need to stay ahead of their peers. So, like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what school's going to look like in the fall because I know a lot of people have had questions about what's going on. I mean, things have been crazy. With COVID-19 cases all over the place. Obviously, schools had to rush initially to implement a new strategy without really any planning in order to keep students safe. And then on top of that, with the changing situation, uh, it's just been very complicated for school districts to adapt. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the things that you should really be considering and what schools might be looking to do as the fall is coming up and maybe for the entire 2020-2021 school year. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So, first, I wanted to kind of just dive into some of the challenges, first of all, because I think it's important that we start from a place of understanding what are the hurdles that school districts and students, families alike will have to jump over in order to really have a safe educational experience. So, obviously, first is COVID 19. That's what started all of this in the first place. And so, with COVID 19, um, we've seen an increasing rate of cases coming from the US. I think I pulled up some numbers just before. Um, I can't find my numbers right now, but obviously, a couple weeks back, the US went over 100,000 cases or 100,000 deaths actually from COVID 19. And of course, there are many more cases as well. And so we've seen mixed responses, a very wide array of mixed responses, in addition to some mixed results as well. So, one thing that's happened is that we've seen, especially in larger cities like New York, where really it hit the hardest in the US, we're seeing cases start to level off in a lot of the big cities. But one trend that we're also starting to see is that cases are tending to accelerate a little bit more in some rural areas as well. And so we've seen the virus spread to some other regions of the US. So, one thing that's definitely going to be a challenge is that more and more districts, more and more areas are going to come into contact with this virus in some shape or form. And so everyone's kind of scrambling to put some sort of plan together to address that. And so perhaps you live in an area where your community hasn't been really affected by the virus so far. That is awesome. I hope it stays that way. But something that we have been seeing is that, it is spreading to more and more areas. So I wouldn't completely rule it out as a possibility. And so you should definitely be talking with your the leaders of your school district about what that's going to look like and start thinking of what kind of plans you might want to implement in case that does start happening. Second is obviously testing and vaccines. So, especially in the US here, we've really struggled to get out of the gate with testing. I know here in Georgia, testing has become a little bit more widely available. However, it is still probably below the threshold as to where a lot of people would like it to be in order to make everyone comfortable with the situation of going back out and kind of returning to the normal day to day. A lot of states have now been pushing to reopen things, reopen businesses, and so on to try to get back to some sort of normal. However, consumer sentiment out there, if you're like me and many people else out there, it kind of still feels a little bit scary, honestly. And so there are still people taking lots of precautions, wearing masks, of course, trying to social distance, and so on. And So without widespread testing where it's easily available, where people have the knowledge of where to get it, where it's easy to acquire from a variety of places, or like your average, doctor, um, a lot of people don't feel the confidence to return to normal like things were. And that goes hand in hand with vaccines as well. Obviously, there's a big push from a lot of different companies to try to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. However, normally that's a process that takes at a minimum several months, and usually takes a couple of years for a lot of companies to go through the process of developing a vaccine, testing it, making sure it's available, and then also making sure it's safe for people and is actually able to do what it's supposed to do. And so we've seen this being attacked from both ends. The FDA has brought down some of the restrictions and normal requirements of what it would take to get a vaccine through the approval process. And this goes the same with testing too. However, on the other end, there's also obviously a big push from companies to try to pour money into researching and developing those vaccines to assist with that as well. You also see this in the testing as well. And one thing I will mention about the testing is that due to some of these lowered restrictions, you have to be careful, especially if you find any, some areas I've heard have over-the-counter tests that are available, or something that you may be able to get from an establishment that you wouldn't normally associate with virus testing. Not all of the tests are made the same, so they're not all the same quality. So you do have to be very careful with that if you are going to a test that would be normally outside of the channels that you would go to in order to, receive that kind of test. Next, of course, is social distancing. And this is a big one for schools because obviously schools have, at least in person, have a limited amount of space. Normally, schools have a pretty large student body, unless it's a private school or a school that's trying to kind of move away from the traditional model. Typically students are pretty packed in their classes, and 20, 30, sometimes even above 30 students per classroom. So that's a big thing that's going to change. And one of the major hurdles that schools need to figure out is how to put social distancing practices into place during the normal class times if they want to convene in person, in addition to doing something, how to enforce it during times that students are outside of class, whether it's a study period or lunch and cafeterias, or, just before and after school, as students are trying to, just communicate with their friends. That's going to be a big thing that schools would have to deal with if they are trying to resume normal operations or anything approaching that. Next is a lack of tech investment. So schools in the past, a lot of schools still don't have much of an investment in technology. We've seen this especially with the scramble to platforms like Zoom and so on. And so when COVID-19 hit, a lot of schools had to scramble to put some sort of implementation in place, trying to get laptops distributed to students, or, make sure everyone would have a stable connection. These are all issues that's been a problem in the US for a long time, especially in rural and minority areas, where the kind of stable high-speed internet that a lot of people, especially in larger cities like Atlanta here, have come to expect, the quality of internet, it's not the same across the board. And this has affected a lot of things, like with testing and the SATs and AP tests, which I'll get into a little bit later. So a lack of the funds across many school districts where they haven't been able to really invest in those things in the past has left a lot of them kind of drifting in the water in terms of a technological solution, which is definitely going to make it harder for smaller communities in trying to deliver the same kind of education when it comes this upcoming fall. And then one of the last challenges that I wanted to mention is that, state budgets are endangered. Right now, states are struggling with just a lot of things that has come from COVID-19. So on the one end, states have seen increased cost. This comes from medical implementations, testing, in addition to increased unemployment payouts and so on, all of which there's still been a lot of struggle with. But in addition to that, states have also seen a declining revenue. So there's less sales taxes because there's less people going out to your brick and mortar location. So there's less shopping, there's less eating out at restaurants and so on. And, so there's a lot of less tax activity overall that states can collect upon. And in addition to that, without people commuting and so on, there's less gas taxes and other things. So state budgets have really been struggling with a lot of that. And in the US, there hasn't been much of a federal response. So the government's response has largely been to leave it up to states with not much assistance, especially monetarily. And so we've seen from many governors asking for some sort of help, in addition to saying that, nearing the end of this month or as budgets roll over, they might have to start making cuts. And, historically, we've seen that when cuts are made, often that affects education as well. And so that's going to affect the ability of schools to deliver quality and safe education with all of these new all of these new restrictions, all of these new things that they have to take into account, in addition to having to, deal with possibly smaller staff. It's possible that you may not have as many teachers working at your school in the fall because your state may have had to do some layoffs. So that is definitely something to also think about, and that's a concern of mine as well. So let's talk about what that might look like at each level of the school system. So first is preschool. And when I mention preschool, I'm talking about maybe pre-K and kindergarten, but also things just like daycare and so on. So the biggest issue here is, of course, budgets and social distancing. Kind of hard to get younger students, individuals to social distance at all. It's hard to explain exactly what's going on in the first place with that. And so there's the added struggle of that. Again, still comes with increased costs for daycare centers and so on, because you have to take into account now, like masks. What are you going to do about social distancing? Will they have to accept less kids? So is there going to be less space available? Will that also add up to increased costs for parents for daycare programs and things like that? So that's one possible consequence of all of this, where we may see a struggle in the availability of daycares. Obviously, up until this point, a lot of daycares had to close down basically because of all of these issues. It's a really hard problem to address. And at least on my end, I haven't seen anything particularly adequate to address that. As states are trying to reopen, of course, some have been reducing some of the restrictions on what they expect of daycares and so on. But it's still very challenging. And again, it comes back to what are parents comfortable with. And so that's going to really strain that particular industry because particularly in the daycare industry, it's largely made up of a lot of smaller operators. If you have a kid in daycare, it's usually run by a very small business that's, maybe local and working with a couple of kids at a time, maybe slightly large from what you've seen, but still it's overwhelmingly small businesses instead of franchises. So that is going to be particularly stretched thin even more, as they already operate on pretty thin margins, and it's going to stress that system out even more. Um, Going into pre-K and kindergarten and so on, that's where we are getting a little bit more into the public school system. And so that leads me into what will it look like for elementary school through high school. So the fact is that it's going to be pretty different, especially when we're looking at how public schools are able to respond versus private schools. Because when we look at public schools, I mentioned before, there's the additional struggles of budgets and lack of tech and so on. Whereas typically with a private school, you most likely would live in an area where there's higher speed internet, where it's a larger city, where they just have more resources to devote towards learning and so on. And so when we're looking at really schooling across the board, I'm most expecting that we'll try to move to some sort of hybrid model. There's more or less three different options that schools have. They can either try to do something and with keeping it as it was before and try to return to normal. So that would mean continuing with in-person classes and instruction. Um, but there would probably be some kind of option of parent choice there, because obviously not everyone's going to be happy or content with that. And so that's one option. There's the hybrid model, which I mentioned. This could involve something like maybe alternating school days, as some half of the student body comes in one day, and then the other half the next set of days, limiting classes. It could be some hybrid of school instruction being taught online and some in the classroom. Maybe the bulk will be online, and then maybe school students can come in at designated hours or something like that for office hours with teachers. There's a lot of different ways that hybrid schooling could go. This is the one that I think is probably the most likely, because a lot of people do still see a lot of value in um, a lot of people still see value in in-person instruction, and it really is different because everyone learns slightly differently. And so for a lot of students, that in-person help is really necessary. Being able to chat with your teacher online, I can't speak for everyone across the board, but at least with the students that I've seen that have come to our company, across the board, a lot of people have been hugely dissatisfied with how the online instruction has been implemented. We've seen this in lawsuits against colleges too, where frankly, families and students just don't think that it's been the same kind of experience. Now, that being said, the school districts will have had a couple of months at least to really think harder about this and implement it. But I still think that many people are probably not going to be as satisfied with the online experience. And so the major push will probably be to have some sort of hybrid model where, again, I would think every school district is going to approach this a little bit differently. But like I said previously, I think it could be some kind of thing where they try to limit class sizes a little bit more, maybe alternate the days that students will come in. So your student might have online classes for instruction one day, and then they come into school the next day. It could be something like again, where people can choose where they do it only online, and then the people that are comfortable with going into the school's location can do that. It may be some kind of system where, again, it's just teachers maybe in the school and staff still keeping everything going, but instruction is still mainly online, and maybe students can come in for office hours to chat with the teacher for any sort of clarification. Who knows? You'd really need to check in with your school district to see what kind of solution that they're implementing, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. And before we go on to college, first we need to talk a little bit about test prep, because this has been one thing that's a real wrench has been thrown into the gears as far as test prep goes. So with test prep, we've seen really, honestly, test prep centers are struggling, and they're struggling hard. Um, we've seen the College Board and ACT, and there's all sorts of different tests out there, and organizations for all sorts of things with students, but the College Board and ACT are the main ones that most people are concerned about. So again, they've been struggling with testing up until this point, because it's really hard. They have high standards to adhere to, in the normal testing environment. You'd have a bunch of students in a room. There'd be a proctor at the head of the room, making sure that everyone's, doing things properly, that they're not moving ahead when they're not supposed to, that no one's cheating, and so on. And so there's been a struggle to implement really any satisfying solution going forward with that. We've seen that the College Board at least tried to move AP tests online, and there were a lot of hiccups with that. A lot of people expressed dissatisfaction with how that went down. And then on the side of like the SAT and ACT, especially in the beginning, we saw a lot of testing dates being continually pushed back. So, what would happen up until this point is that, they would try to reschedule and push back some dates, kind of wait and see what was going to go on and happen with the virus. And then as things neared, likely the week before, they had to push it back or change the testing location and so on. And so the tests are going to particularly struggle with social distancing. The College Board has said that there's going to definitely be a decreased availability in-person space for testing centers. So it's going to be harder for you to take the test in person. At the same time, they have looked into implementing an online solution, but again, there's an issue with that, especially because these tests are long. So with the SAT and ACT, normally those are 3 to 3.5 hour tests. On the normal timeline, and even longer if you add in optional sections like the writing section. And so, one thing that we've seen from the College Board is that they've said that they probably are not moving forward with an online solution right now. Again, coming back to the availability of quality online. Availability for people across the nation. Basically, it's there's just no fair way to implement that test if they were to try to move everything online. Reason being because it would be, as the state of how things are in the US with the internet, it would be completely unreasonable to expect that every student would be able to have quality, high speed internet for a period of 3 to 4 hours to take this test. Because what they're looking at is, maybe having a proctor. Look in, there have been testing implementations where, you log into whatever system that they use, and then you may have a actual proctor, someone on the other side of the screen that's there and actually looking at you, making sure that your space around you doesn't have anything that you could use to cheat, that you're not making any sort of suspicious motions and so on. And so, especially on such short notice, that's kind of what they're looking at. But then again, this comes back to that a lot of areas really just don't have the quality internet that it would take to have that sort of implementation. So I think we're going to continue to see testing dates being pushed back even further. One of the highlights of this, though, is that in response to this, a lot of colleges have recognized that it would be kind of unreasonable for them to expect to have testing dates and so on. So I think we'll see even more colleges say this, if they haven't already, where they're going to move to a testing optional model, at least for the time being, where they're not going to be requiring uh, submission of the SAT or ACT test results along with your college application. So we've seen a slew of colleges go towards saying that, just forget about that for this year at least. And, I'm assuming that as colleges, you know, do this a little bit more, just like we've seen in other areas where everything has moved online with working from home and virtual working. I think this is going to become a little sticky as well. And so we're going to see more colleges kind of stick with a testing optional method as they find, figure out that, maybe this is fine for us, especially probably with your smaller schools. They'll probably stick with that a little bit more. But like I said, a lot of schools have moved to a testing optional model. Some schools have said that they're going to, they're going to completely just cancel the fall semester for a couple of colleges, and you know, so it's definitely kind of all over the place across the board when it comes to colleges. So, speaking about colleges, like I said, same thing. We're going to see an even wider variety of responses from colleges because they all kind of act, at least outside of state schools, they all act independently of one another. So, I think we're still going to see some sort of hybrid model where the campuses are open, especially the essential services and things like that. However, um, there's going to definitely be a bigger push to online. I can even see this at the smaller liberal arts colleges because if you've ever been in those small classrooms, well, they're small physically too, and so. Same thing, we're going to have social distancing restrictions. And as I mentioned a little bit more up top, is that a lot of students and families have been dissatisfied with the proposed solutions as well. So you're going to see less students on campus as many students are thinking about, maybe I'll attend, but only if it's still in person, or maybe online is fine. Some people are thinking about taking a gap year. So there's a wide mix of responses as to how people want to approach that sort of thing. So, like I said, some schools have already taken it upon themselves to say that, just forget about the fall. We're going to restart in the spring. Some have said that, okay, we're going to do some sort of hybrid where you can come on campus and there's still going to be in person instruction. Some are tinkering with the idea of maybe completely doing online classes. Obviously, I don't think this is going to affect as much your like your community colleges or the online universities that already exist out there. They've got their model down pat, and the expectation is already there. But there's going to be a large shift for a lot more colleges to invest and work on ways to improve their online classes as well. So again, I think it's going to be a hybrid where with college, we're going to see a lot of people kind of shift there. And so ultimately, as I've mentioned a couple of times, I think we're going to see some sort of hybrid when it comes to what school looks like in the fall. Obviously, there's still a lot to be said. There's a lot that can change. But from the trends that we've seen up until this point, it really looks like, at least in the overall US numbers, it really hasn't done much flattening out at all. So it's still, the cases are still increasing pretty steadily. So seeing as the response to this point, even though there is a push to open things up, I think still people are going to be pretty cautious, maybe a little bit less cautious on the lower end of the spectrum with younger students, because as things have seemed to this point, it seems that younger individuals are less susceptible to the extreme symptoms of the virus. And so, people might be a little bit more willing to open up, the lower grades, partially for that reason, and partially because that instruction really is a lot more critical for younger students of that age as well. So I think people might try to be a little more lenient on that end of the spectrum, and then maybe towards your older students, like end of middle school and high school, then we might be looking where those kind of schools are going to be more comfortable with a hybrid or online model. When it comes to colleges, I think it's going to be very much a hybrid model where, again, for a lot of them, some availability in person, but largely trying to push online of some part. Of some part, because a lot of colleges still do try to push, the amenities that are on campus, and all the dorms and services and availability of the teachers. So there's still going to be a push towards in-person instruction on that end, or at least try to emphasize some availability of that, because that's what students want. That's what the colleges kind of use to sell themselves as well. So it's definitely going to be a large mix of responses. So really, in regards to this, my resource of today is going to be, all of the things that I've talked about. Really, when it comes to COVID-19, the major person or organization that you should be listening to is the CDC. That's what they're in charge of keeping track of this and helping direct the response. And so you should largely be paying attention to the directors of the CDC. Go on their website. All it is, let's see, it's cdc.gov. So, check out with the CDC as to what they're saying, what they're suggesting as to what kind of precautions you should be taking, what kind of precautions you should be seeing at the state level and school level and so on. At this point, CDC has said that schools are not particularly required to do stuff like testing and so on. And so again, it's going to be a mix as to how comfortable people are comfortable with that. And so again, but the major source in terms of COVID should be paying attention to the CDC's direction, especially what they're putting up on their website. When it comes to your school, pay attention to the school district, because they're the ones that know. So your school district will tell you, what they're thinking about. At least on any of the school districts I've seen around here, a lot of them have a big banner on the front page as to, like, this is our COVID response. So figure out what school district that you're a part of, or what school, and go to their website, see what they've proposed, see what your superintendent has proposed, and what kind of things that they've been talking about, to see exactly how your school is going to respond to that. As far as the College Board and ACT, definitely check in with them as far as things go for SAT and ACT dates, especially because it's continually changing to this point. So, you might want to make an account on both of those websites and enable whatever feature they have to send you notifications and updates right now, so that you can make sure that you're on top of everything, whether your test date is changing, or, if it's canceled, if it's, if they have new options implemented. As of right now, if you signed up for a test and it gets rescheduled, it's not like you have to pay for that again. But again, the constant rescheduling may really upset your schedule. So it's really important to check in with them and keep on top of, what exactly the response will be there. And then lastly, before we go, I think it's really important for everyone to start thinking about what your backup plan is going to be. So you need to think about, okay, if my school, responds to doing in-person instruction, am I okay with that? Do I want my child to attend if they're going to mainly remain as things were before, or do I want more? If you do want more, then you may also want to take it upon yourself to start getting involved with your school district. Talk to the superintendents, talk to the people that are making those decisions, and make your voice heard that you are not comfortable with the current response, if that's where you are at right now. And so you can also have an important voice in driving how your school district is going to move forward with how they approach education and instruction in the fall. So it's important that you're speaking out about that as well. But do have start thinking and have some sort of backup plan in place in case things just don't go the way that you're expecting. I know we've had multiple inquiries here about people asking us to take over some primary instruction where we're working with students kind of on a homeschool basis to help them work through subjects that they would be covering that they covered at the end of last school year, in addition to moving on to some of the things in the fall for what they would expect to go over in the upcoming school year. So have a backup plan because things are going to be pretty crazy for the next couple of months. And so it's really important that you're not blindsided by that as well, especially if you want your child's education to continue moving forward smoothly. So that's all I have for today, guys. I hope you are able to really take these tips and suggestions to heart and find a solution that's working for you. I'll continue to keep you updated on what's going on with these organizations and try to assist you with tips in staying on top of everything as we are moving forward and as the situation changes with the virus. So make sure, again, to check in with your local organizations to see what they think about that, and also start thinking about what your backup plan might be, whether you may have to step in for some supplementary education, maybe do kind of a little more effort and instruction on your end, or if you resort to a tutor like us, or if you might want to, just kind of go completely homeschool for next year. Whatever the option is out there, it's important to start thinking about it now, again, so that you can make sure that the education is consistent moving forward and that you have a plan to get to where you want to be. So that's it for today, guys. I will talk to you again in 2 weeks. Stay safe out there and hope you have a great day.